welcome to Avodas HaParsha here in the beautiful neighborhood of Shai Chesed Yerushalayim and the wonderful Kehillah of Ner Avram. Korach is always supposed to be the favorite Parsha of Darshonim. Right? You can just go on about Korach endlessly from all sorts of angles. And there are even, for the more adventurous, you find both in certain Hasidic Sfarim and in some of the Bali Musar, like Rabbi Isaac Sher, I believe, that they talk about the positive sides of Korach, right? And there's the famous Sofei Tevos, Tzadik Katomar Yifrach, the Sofei Tevos spell Korach, meaning that with everything that happened, here's Barry. So with everything that happened, there's an idea that Korach, first of all, he was a great person to start with. He was a person with tremendous madrega. He was one of those who carried the Aron, and we know that the Aron carried those who carried it, which means that every time Am Yisrael traveled, he went through this supernatural experience. He had a level of Ruach HaKodesh, and yet, we're meant to learn from every detail of the story, even down to our own personal weaknesses. And there are so many things you can learn from it. And that's why the writings about Korach are endless. We're going to take a look here from someone called the Marsham of Brezhan. Marsham of Brezhan was really, they called him like the Meshiv Hador in the generation, the late 1800s, early 1900s. He lived in Galicia, but people sent him shilas from all over, both from Lita and Poland and Russia and Israel, even Yerushalayim. He was a tremendous posek. He was also a great darshan. So his name was Rav Sholem Mordechai Cohen Shvadron. The famous Maggid Rav Sholem Shvadron was his grandson or great-grandson. I forget which, maybe even grandson. So he has his drushes on the Torah sefer called Tchilas Mordechai. And I saw it in a shul, and this is part of the joy of this shir. I'm always like hunting around for things. So I go into a shul and I'm looking at Parshas Korach, and I found some fascinating things. And he starts off one of his pieces on Korach with a story Mr. Deutsch mentioned a few weeks ago that was a very controversial story. This is a story that is brought most famously in the Mishnayos Tiferes Yisrael. And he was criticized greatly for bringing this story down and got attacked in many ways. So I'll tell you the story. It says that there was an Arab king who heard about the Jews traveling through the desert, right? And he heard that they had a leader who was incredibly wise, incredibly righteous. Oh, you brought it? Okay. This is Shevach told us. And he had an artist who was able to really draw a portrait of somebody that showed the personality of the person. And he sent this artist, and the artist came back, and he called his chachamim who understood these things to look at the portrait. And the chachamim said, this portrait shows, if this is accurate, this person has the worst midos, the worst attributes in the world, right? The lowest to the low. And the king started yelling at the artist, how can that be, right? You messed up, right? Because this is this famous, wise, right, leader, Moshe Rabbeinu, right, that there's all these miraculous things happening around him. And the artist said, really, I did, it's accurate. And they're all blaming each other, and the king decides he's going to go and visit Moshe Rabbeinu, right? So he goes to visit, and he says, my artist says this, they say that, what's going on? He says, they're both right. He said, your artist showed what my nature was originally, right? And they were able to see that. Those midos are there in me, but I overcame them. And that was how I became who I became, right? That I was able to work on them and transform them until I was able to become who I became. So this went off like a bomb in the world of Torah, right? Like, how can you say this about Moshe Rabbeinu? And this is Kfira. And Chachmei Yerushalayim wrote these letters, Mariel Diskin and the Aderes.
How long ago were they?
Who the Chachmei Yerushalayim who are writing. So this was at the beginning of the 1900s, late 1800s.
So I got that story from the Me'am Loez. That's 500 years old.
Oh, right. In other words, the Tiferes Yisrael didn't write it himself.
Okay.
Right. He says it's found in the Ksovim. Now, some people say that it's actually a mashal that came from non-Jewish sources even, and was kind of transcribed onto Moshe Rabbeinu. We'll get to that defense in a second, okay? But Rabboni Yerushalayim, again, Rabboni Minlita, it was the Maggid of Vilkomer who was called, came out against it, fire. Letters went to Yerushalayim, the Aderes, the Leo David Rabinovitz Tumim, who had been the Rav of Ponevezh, and then moved to Yerushalayim, became the Rav in Yerushalayim. He was Rav Kook's father-in-law. So he wrote a letter against it, and the Maril Diskin really took it apart, like technically. Couldn't be that this artist could come in. Moshe Rabbeinu was in the Machne Shechina, the Levim were there to protect, that Zorim wouldn't come in, all sorts of things which were there. But there was a great Rav in Lita called, known as the Zecher Yehosef, that's his Shilas and Shuvas. His name was Rav Stern. What was his first name? I wrote it down. He was the Rav of Shovel, Rav Yosef Zachariah Stern. And he said that you don't have to attack him like this. He says it was written b'derech malitza, the mashal, meaning it wrote something which is true that we have to know, and it wrote it in the form of this story. But he says the very fact that it's there is true, okay? Meaning that a person has inside of themselves negative things. And we know that we say, when a person is greater than another, yitzra gadol himenu. And there is this idea of having to transform, and that's what brings the greatness. And he said that's so important as a chizuk for people who find these negative things inside themselves. They find negative tendencies, they find all these things, and therefore, right, you show them that can be the source of your greatness. And if you fell, you get up again. Sheva yipol tzadik v'kom. Right, it says in Mishlei that the tzadik falls down 7 times and gets up. Rav Hutner explained that is not that because he's a tzaddik, he has the ability to fall 7 times and get up. That's what makes him a tzaddik, that process of falling and getting up. So how does this relate to Korach? So the Marsham says like this. He says that Korach comes and he says, Kol ha'edo kulam kedoshim, right? Uvesochem Hashem, madua tisnasu al kal Hashem. Am Yisrael are people who are kadosh. And in fact, it says that Am Yisrael reached before Chet HaEgel, right? Nifsaka zu hamosam, meaning the contamination of that first Chet of Adam Harishon had disappeared. Only with Chet HaEgel did it come back, and we're still correcting that process. So he says, people who reach such a level of Kedusha should not have leaders who got problems. Moshe Rabbeinu, and he says, Korach could have seen like that king saw, it's a person who had to overcome bad midos, right? And Aaron said, had a chelak in Chet HaEgel, right? He was obviously there in the story. Okay, so he says they should have someone who's befitting, someone who hasn't sinned, someone who was pure. Was Korach like that, perhaps? Right? Did he, not have such bad midos to struggle with? Perhaps, right? It could be, but he said certainly someone with these problems, that isn't leadership material for such a holy people. So this is where he got it wrong, right? This is where he got it wrong. Why? So the Marsham brings something from the Drashas Haran. And the Drashas Haran says it's simply like you can see it in a physical property, that the strength of something comes out when it has to deal with its opposite. He says, one example, if you have a big fire and you pour some water on the fire, the flames leap up. Okay, that's what happens. It brings that out more. He uses it to explain the chelbana in the Ketores. Okay, the Ketores had different spices. It made this beautiful incense. It said it filled the Til Yericho with the beautiful scent of the incense. But one of the ingredients, chelbana, was something that didn't smell nice. Okay, and the Chazal uses an example. It says that kol tainis, right? Anytime there's a fast and it doesn't have mitposhe Yisrael, and people who are sinners are not included in it, so that's not a real fast as it should be. So, first of all, the Talmud Rebbe points out, I think I told you, he says, Rashi defines chelbana as bosem sharei chora. It's a spice, a perfume that smells bad. He says, what kind of spice smells bad? Right? You don't, he says, because be'etzem, it has the goodness inside of it. It's when it joins together with the other spices that its good smell is able to come out. So he says here, the presence of the chelbana, number one, increases the tefillos of those parts of Am Yisrael that are not such sinners. It leads them to heights, and that enables the sinner also to be transformed. Just as in the Ketores, that the presence of the chelbana made the sweet spices smell even more sweet, right? As they themselves strengthened to transform. So this is a principle that we find. So therefore, he says, Moshe Rabbeinu, in dealing with this is how he became so great, greater than any other human being, right? That there was no other Novi Kamosha. How did he reach that? Because his battle against these negative midos and transforming them each time propelled him higher and higher. He says it makes sense that someone who was on that level had those terrible tendencies inside of him, because it was through that struggle that he was able to get there. Okay, this is, and he brings the fascinating thing. It says in the Gemara in Megillah, it asks, Moshe min haTorah minayin. Where do we find Moshe in the Torah? We find Moshe all over the Torah. Okay, but you're looking, right? You're looking for this little source that shows us something about the essence of Moshe. Like the question with Esther, right? Is there Esther min haTorah minayin v'anochi haster aster poneh bayomahu? So it says Moshe's in the Torah when it talks about the Dor HaMabul and what led them to sin, b'shagom hu basar, because they are flesh. B'shagom is Gematria Moshe. That's where he is. Okay, so why is he there? He says because that's exactly it. Moshe Rabbeinu was a flesh and blood human being who could have descended to the level of Chet HaMabul, right? And it's only because he was able to do that, right, to reach it, was he able to get to that level. Now, here he brings a fascinating thing, just a rereading of, right, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu said, to defend Am Yisrael, he says, Hashem, if you're not going to forgive them, erase me from the book that you wrote. But the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, what sefer is that? Sifron Shel Rishoyim, the sefer of Rishoyim. Number one, logically, it doesn't make sense. Right? What do you mean, erase me from the Sefer of Rishoyim? And we always talk about Moshe Rabbeinu coming here to defend Am Yisrael, and his saying, if you're not going to forgive them, erase me, is this tremendous self-sacrifice. And some people point to Parshas Tetzaveh, that Moshe Rabbeinu's name doesn't appear there, etc. So he says, what does it mean, B'sifron Shel Rishoyim? Moshe Rabbeinu says, I am only their leader because I had to overcome everything a flesh and blood human being could have to overcome. And if you're not going to forgive them, that means that a person who does tshuva isn't fit to lead them. You need a tzaddik that never sinned, that never had any bad tendencies to do that. Therefore, take me out of Sifron Shel Rishoyim, where I'm written down with the Dor HaMabul, because that's my starting point. If you're saying that that's a minus, so if you're not going to accept them, so then you can't accept me. That's the way he said it. So here it's such a flip of what Korach was saying. And it's very important. So the Zecher Yehosef said, that's why this story is so important. This story gives such encouragement to people. When they find negative tendencies in themselves, that doesn't mean that you're bad, right? One of the questions asked about, they say, how can it be? It says in the Torah, Vatera ki tovu, when Moshe Rabbeinu was born, the house was filled with light, right? He was tov. But if you're telling me he was born with these terrible tendencies, how could you say that? Because the fact that a person has terrible tendencies doesn't mean that they're not tov. For example, Eretz Yisrael is called Ha'eretz HaTova. So Chazal say that where are the openings of Gehinnom? In Eretz Yisrael. The Imre Emes, the Ger Rebbe, when he was coming from Europe after he escaped with a couple of his sons, he said, you fought the Yetzer Hara in Europe, he said, but you should know Eretz Yisrael is his home office, right? Meaning, any place that has more Kedusha, so that's another way that the opposite awakens. The opposition awakens when the Kedusha is there. That's why it's such a difficult struggle. It's also why when the Torah warns Am Yisrael, K'maise Eretz Mitzrayim asher yeshavtem bo, u'k'maise Eretz Canaan, that you're going, Shevet bo, you shouldn't do, talking about all sorts of abominations and Avodah Zarah. Don't do like they did in Mitzrayim where you lived. Don't do like they do in Canaan where you're going to live. So Rashi says that the places where Am Yisrael lived had the worst depravity of all. Why? The Sfarim explained, because when the Kedusha of Am Yisrael comes, so the power of Tumah awakens to do battle. That's simply there. So a person should know and be able to see and sense that. It's interesting that the Rebbe brings down from the Sfarim of Nistar, what you call Sfarim HaKadoshim, they say that Korach was Cain and Moshe was Hevel, meaning it was like a replay of Cain and Hevel. Why? Because Cain felt that he failed. Cain brought the korban, Hashem ignored it, right? Didn't like it, and he became very upset. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him, why should you get so upset? If you do good, you will go up. But Cain somehow didn't believe that. He didn't feel that once he had failed in some way, that could be a springboard to seis, to going up and going up higher. Embrace it if that's where you are, and use it as a springboard to where you can go. Hevel, on one hand, he missed out. He didn't come up with the idea of the korban. Cain did. Hevel just copied him. But instead of letting that get down and say, oh, I'm not like my brother, he thought of a korban, I didn't think of that, he simply went into it to use it as much as he could, right, to be able to rise up. So this is, he said, the argument between Korach and Moshe Rabbeinu, so to speak, is something that's very pertinent to all of us. And we ourselves oftentimes think, right, that because I'm not this pure tzaddik, so then, number one, that I'm bad and that I'm a failure, or, that this isn't for me, that this isn't shaykh for me. We find in the Gemara in Shabbos, he brings also that when Moshe Rabbeinu came to receive the Torah, so the Malachim protested. They said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, Tno hodcha l'shamayim, keep your glory in the heavens. Why are you giving it to this? And Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, right, hold on to my throne and answer them. And Moshe Rabbeinu gave the famous answer, right? Do you have a Yetzer Hara? Did you go to Mitzrayim? Did you have, parents that you have to do kibbud av va'em? So the answer is that even though there is an aspect of the Torah that exists that the Malachim can, so to speak, enjoy and experience, but the light of Torah they can't see. Because he brings a famous statement from the Zohar Kodesh, Les chashoicha el migo nahara. Les nahara el migo chashoicha. I'm sorry, there is no light unless it comes from darkness. Okay, that and evil, right? There's no sense of good unless there is a presence of evil. So Moshe Rabbeinu told them, he says, you can't have the light of Torah. The Torah only shines through people like us, right? Even if you have an understanding of the Torah, but without that battle, without that struggle, the Torah doesn't shine. That level of the Torah isn't there and isn't accessible. So there's great strengthening for us to be able to keep ourselves up. And we find this with other people as well. First of all, let's just say that there were many Chashuv Sforim that did bring this story, this mashal, this idea, right? Both in the world of Hasidus, especially, which is interesting because some of the Hasidic Rebbes were great opponents of the story. It's brought, but we find it with other people as well, right? We find that David HaMelech, who was born Admoni. Admoni, we know somebody else in Tanakh who's described as being born red, Uncle Esav, right? And that is supposed to be a sign of murderous tendencies. Right? They say that's why channel it, become a moil, become a shochet, or something that you have a tendency toward blood. But David HaMelech fought and wrestled and overcame these things to the extent that toward the end of his life, he said, Libi cholo bekirbi, I've actually emptied out my Yetzer Hara. I've transformed it. I've done it. So the fact that our great people had these things and have it is something that we have to see and be able to learn from. A person who has tendencies, right, even the worst tendencies, and this is how the Yetzer can shock us sometime, should simply realize that that's his pathway to greatness. And in transforming them, the person becomes even greater. There was an exchange of tshuvas I saw, I think it was between the Stipler and Reb Menashe Klein, right? Both great Talmidei Chachamim Poskim. And it was about a question that came up in a shidduch, a sensitive kind of question. That Chazal say that if a person is born from his mother had been a nida, had not done the family purity, so they have a tendency toward chutzpah. They have a tendency toward being chutzpahdik. So the person asked about this with a shidduch, and the Stipler said, well, look at the person. If they're not chutzpahdik, if they have good midas, that means they overcame that tendency and they're an exceptional person. He says that's a plus for that person, not a minus. The Alter Nevardik was once approached by a Talmud who was shocked by his own tendencies. Right? He said, I have such tendencies, I have such terrible desires, such terrible midos. So the Alter Nevardik answered him very succinctly. He said, listen, young man, if it can't become chametz, it can't become matzah. Right? And that's exactly what we're saying. Meaning, there's this explosive combination when we prepare for Pesach, flour and water. And the flour has to be from 5 specific types of grain. Those are the only ones that can become chametz, but those are the only ones that can make matzah. Chametz, which is public enemy number 1 in Pesach, and matzah, which is the king of Pesach, all come from the same combination. So only because you can go so low can you go so high. That simply says exactly the nature of who we are and what we are and how to see it. Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz, the Mashgiach in the Mir Yeshiva, was asked by a Talmud once about the Chazal. Chazal said, Yitzur shalodam mischadesh shelo b'chol yom, that a person's Yetzer renews itself every day. You fought the Yetzer one day, you thought you won, next day he comes back, totally new tactics, totally new. And it says, Ilmoli HaKadosh Baruch Hu ozu lo yochel. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't help you, you wouldn't be able to defeat him. And this Talmud asks, why is that fair? Why shouldn't it be that I defeat him and he's defeated? Why? It's so exhausting. For all of my life, I'm going to have a battle with the Yetzer Hara, and he renews and he becomes different and all these kind of things. So Rabbi Yochanan pointed at him, he said, it's because you have endless potential. That's why. That battle is there to bring out the potential in you. So Korach's misunderstanding, right, teaches us a very important picture of Kedusha and leadership in Am Yisrael, of who we are. I saw an interesting thing. It was a sefer that brought down Torah from Rabbi Aryeh Levin Zatzal, right? Not far from here, and the famous Yerushalmi Tzaddik, and he was very close to Rav Kook. And he said the following. Rav Kook was known as a person with great Avas Yisrael, but he also had many opponents who gave him a lot of opposition. And Rav Kook once told Rabbi Aryeh Levin, he said, I think I know why I have so much opposition, right? Why people, pursue me, persecute me, whatever you call it. He said, because when I was in the yeshiva in Volozhin, there was a boy in the yeshiva with us who I suspected of having wrong opinions, apikorsis, some level of heresy. And I saw to it that he was removed from the yeshiva. And he said, I think that's why I suffer from this opposition. So Rabbi said, it's an interesting story, but that's not the message that I get from it. The message I get from it is the following. Rav Kook was be'etzem, he said, a kanoi, a zealot. He was fire against anything that he saw that was wrong. People thought that he was kind of flopsy-mopsy. Okay, you have a chalutz, he doesn't keep Shabbos, he eats chazer, but he's building the land. I'm going to try to strengthen the good in him that'll draw him to Torah, something like this, because that was his nature. He says that was not his original nature. He said he had to deal with the fact that his fiery, explosive kanos, he had to contain and work through. And again, don't think there are many, many writings of Rav Kook, very sharp against so many things that were going wrong. It's a terribly wrong picture that people say, oftentimes the very non-religious public figures, if only we had a rabbi like Rabbi Kook nowadays or something like this. Rav Kook fought against so many things, whether in Chilul Shabbos or this or that or any other halacha, right? These things were very fiery, but he was able to work and channel those tendencies in the right way. So that's what we see. Sometimes it's frightening to see a person and we don't choose the mix of midos that we're born with. It's true. There's nature, there's nurture, but there certainly is. Even the nurture is something min hashamayim because HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts you into a certain family in certain circumstances. But you can see that and turn that and transform it. A friend of mine said a very wise thing. His parents got divorced, and he said it upsets him sometime when people say, oh, if you're a child of divorced parents, so you didn't see a fully functional family, and that means, it's almost written in stone that you're going to have problems in your marriage as well. He says, why not say that from a young age, I saw problems in a marriage, and I started thinking then of how to make a good marriage, and started thinking then of how to learn about it. That I'm actually going to come to marriage at a higher point than just some guy who grew up in his family, his parents got along, that's okay. It's a wonderful thing. We want that to be 100%. But he said, from this, I used it to grow. People should see it that way. And each situation HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us, we're supposed to see. So that's why this argument, which seems from the surface to be something about who gets which job, is actually a very deep discussion of what's greatness in Am Yisrael and where greatness comes from. And as the Zecher Yosef said, this should give everybody strength and encouragement, no matter where they are, who they are, what they are, to move ahead and use all of those things as a springboard to reach higher and higher. Wonderful week.